Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. As always, I have Sophia with me if you can see the camera, and she is, as always, she's being very sweet and docile. I think she's a ragamuffin. So, in this episode, we're looking at Immanuel Kant's an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? And enlightenment is a whole era in history or in modern philosophy. It gets critiqued a couple hundred years later. So remember that modern philosophy is roughly 1600 to 1850. And this is written 1784. Kant passed away in like early 1800s, 1802, 1804, or something like that. And so like his some of his final works, I think, was like the Anthropology and Kant writings. And I can go ahead and screen share. Sorry, I was just checking on some, like I pulled up Task Manager and my laptop's a little warm, but we should be fine. Yeah, he passed away in 1804 at 80. Never married, he was a bachelor. Kant is really famous for changing a lot of things in philosophy and kind of coming at an inflection moment in the history of philosophy. He's so big that he is considered up there with like Plato and Aristotle. I think the other people that get considered um, to be as influential as him would be like Aquinas, um, maybe Augustine. Um, Yeah, and there are certainly like plenty of greats. It just seems Kant cuts across a lot of things. Um, I guess I'll say this again. I don't really want to do like a long. We have to do the grounding for the metaphysics of morals as well, but it's going to be in a different series. And since I'm doing multiple Kant writings in different series, I don't really want to spend too much time in either series talking about Kant himself. We can just go straight to the ideas. So in this one, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? It's pretty short and it's kind of a concise presentation of one way of thinking about enlightenment and what it means. It's very direct. Kant is a very organized writer. Um, when he presents his ideas, they flow very naturally, very intuitively, but he can be kind of hard to understand and follow. Um, I guess one thing I'll say is that Kant, his metaphysics or his cognitive science, depending on how you take it, um, is one of the starting points other than Descartes for phenomenology. Kant separates the appearance of things from things in themselves. And so far, when we've talked about Bergson, Spinoza, Descartes, um, this sort of affective phenomenology we've been building up, um, we've basically gotten rid of the in itself, or we've identified the in itself with the phenomena, which is still plausible. I don't think that we really need to do what Kant does and talk about and things in themselves that we can never access. For Kant, actually, the in itself is inaccessible. And that's why phenomenologists just go to the phenomena. That's why they think that you have to be able to trust the givenness of the world. Um, what this means for Kant is that like the in itself or he calls them noumena. So I guess they're like the input to our conscious experience. And then once we get that input, we give it space and time. Um, his arguments for this are kind of mathematical and transcendental and they're strange. But yeah, that's all the rundown I want to do for phenomenology. I'll probably talk about it a little bit again when we get to Sartre. But it links up here, and we're not doing his epistemology, Kant's, cognitive science or epistemology. It's the critique for pure reason or the prolegomena for any future metaphysics that may come forth as a science. The prolegomena being a shorter presentation of his ideas because the critique of pure reason was too complicated. Um, I say it was too complicated. It's probably the more he revised it a lot between the first and second editions. It's fairly obscure, and he wrote the prolegomena to try to help people understand his ideas. Let's put it that way. And this came like 10 years, I think, before. He also spent 10 years in solitude figuring out the critique for pure reason. He had a manservant or a house servant that he depended on, I think, for much of his life. I think it was the same person. And this person would cook for them, cook for Kant, and wake them up on time and make sure they stuck to their schedule. Um, so they were very like ascetic and disciplined, but also kind of like submitting themselves into this collaborative um, structure or schedule that allowed Kant to be very productive over his life. And which is great because, it's really helpful, some of the things he's figured out. Um, right. So 1784, in answer to the question, what is enlightenment? I don't think I'm even showing myself anymore. Let's do side by side. Okay. And cool. And the reason I like to have them side by side is because I think some people find seeing a person engaging, and so hopefully that helps. But about 150, 160 years later, some critical theorists, Horkheimer and Adorno, of the Frankfurt School, in 1944, in the middle of World War II, and Sartre published some phenomenology around that time too. Um, Mid 40s German philosophy is a train wreck that we can talk about some other time, but specifically when we get to phenomenology, because we'll talk about how Sartre was in internment camps during the war, how he read Heidegger, who was a German Nazi during the war, how he was influenced by Heidegger, even though you have to repudiate quite a bit of who the person was as a violent fascist, um, who literally reported on his colleagues and said, "Come get this person." That's who Heidegger was. So I don't even dignify Heidegger, but I respect at least that Sartre was influenced by him. Anyway, that's not or Carmen Adorno. It's just they're also German in the middle of World War II, and their book is a set of critiques. One of the things they talk about in their critique of enlightenment is that any kind of utility knowledge or utilitarian knowledge or goal-based knowledge or instrumental knowledge, right? Instrumental goods where we know how to do something, we have knowledge by having power to manipulate something in a certain way. Um, all of these cause estrangement and alienation from different ways we could conceive of being the world. Okay. So that's kind of like where you could go from here if you are suspicious of enlightenment because it didn't pan out the way it promised. Some of the things that enlightenment promises are perpetual progress, um, the goodness of technology as saving us, um, the superiority of science over religion or myth, or Keimer and Adorno are critical of, um, they think that science is more mythical and it's not as objective as we want it to be or need it to be, not yet at least. again, those are just responses to what we are actually going to be talking about here today. And what we're talking about here today is much more faithful and optimistic and hopeful that enlightenment is possible. Um, and I find, tendencies of this train of thought in my own thinking as well, that the belief that a just society would require everyone to be awakened or everyone to be self-determining and self-regulating. Um, when we get to the moral philosophy in the next series, because I'm going to split the Kant into two series, like I said. Um, Kant discusses it, I say discusses. Kant proposes a heaven on earth kingdom of ends where every person is following the universal law. And because of that, we're all respecting each other and we're all doing our part and working hard or working as hard as we can and helping each other as much as we can, sharing resources and making kind and wise decisions. The decisions we'd want everybody to make. Um, and the fact that the decisions are what everyone would independently make, but they're the same decisions. Kant calls this the autonomy of reason. We're gonna have to talk about this in the next series anyway, so let's not get too bogged down on it here. But just think of that alongside this sort of mass enlightenment. But in a way, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment, is also Kant's political epistemology. So let's look at the guiding questions. What is enlightenment for Kant? What produces enlightenment? What is the difference between the public and private uses of reason? And I'll add a few to that. We'll say the I think I've typed it somewhere. And if I've already typed it, then I want to give you exactly what it is. Not there. Um, why is it always a violation of human rights to set down a set of rules that can never be questioned, altered, revised, or rewritten? So basically, in an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? We'll talk about um, what enlightenment is, why it is not always achieved, um, how we can get out of it, how it's kind of inevitable that we always end up getting out of it. Um, and then he clarifies like when we're free to do things and when we're not free to do things, like when we're working in an organization where others depend on us or when we're um, like in our own free time. And then Kant talks about political tyranny and he has a king when he's writing. So he was I don't even think it was Germany. I think it was Prussia. Um, and so the king of Prussia, right? Like Kant's not writing in a democracy, Kant's writing in a monarchy. But the king still has a relationship to his or her subjects, um, the monarch. And this relation is one of care and responsibility. And so Kant says that if a leader lets one citizen rule over the others and take advantage of them and doesn't address that, then they violate their right to rule as well and make a mockery of it. We'll read all this. But the main thing is what is enlightenment? What is public and private reason? Um, and why is it important for people to always be able to reinterpret their traditions or criticize the ways that things are done. And we saw that Spinoza advocated for free thought in public and private matters, or in religious and government matters, in spiritual and material matters. And Kant's distinction is a little bit different because you don't quite have free thought in um, private uses of reason, but you do have free thought in public uses of reason. So they're actually backwards from what you might expect. Private is whenever you're working with an organization, and public is whenever you're in your own time. And the reason for this is because public reason is addressed publicly, meaning universally, while working for an organization does externalize your labor or your reason. It's still private in the sense that it's in a constrained local environment, whereas public reason is written down and published. It's interesting that publication is very similar to public. I think that's a common root, but um, so yeah, they're kind of backwards. Maybe not what you'd expect. Let's start reading. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. So what is enlightenment? Man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. But then what is the immaturity and what does it mean for it to be self-imposed? That's what else we'll see in this paragraph. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Separe aude, have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of enlightenment. That's the end of the first point. These points are organized into paragraphs. These paragraphs are organized into points. They each, um, some of the paragraphs are very long and they each have their own numbers. So they're kind of like epitaphs, or not epitaph, but also not what I was looking for. I always get these confused. Uh, I forget the word. Nietzsche and Benjamin are known for this. Aphoristic. Aphorisms. They're longer than aphorisms, but it's still more self-contained, sort of step-by-step presentation. And a paragraph should always be self-contained. If you have more than one topic or idea in a paragraph, you should consider making it multiple paragraphs. Which is also like why I'm splitting the Enlightenment lecture from the grounding lecture, because I may use them in different classes or use them in the same class. It's also why I split the Descartes meditations up. Anyway, using your own reason, just kind of like trusting yourself and throwing yourself into it and practicing. Um, it's not quite effort, so to speak, but when we had the interview with Ed, we talked about being on edge and continuing to find new edges in your life and finding ways to have this draw out more energy and perception and consciousness and vivacity in your life. Um, and then I was talking with a student too about radical acceptance and kind of like always sort of committing or throwing into the experience more deeply and more intensely, um, even if not doing or pursuing reckless or dangerous behaviors in that drive for experimentation and novel experiences, etc., and energy and like richness of life, etc. Um, and so we kind of rethought, instead of throwing yourself into really being hard on yourself and pushing yourself really hard, like, et cetera, or taking risks or putting too much pressure to get things done in a certain way, et cetera. Instead of doing all that or finding ways to do that safely, you can just like really be present and throw yourself into the present by accepting it for what it is. And I think that's related to enlightenment and emerging from it. Have courage to use your own understanding. Throw yourself out there. All right, paragraph 2, point number 2. Laziness and cowardice are the reasons why so great a proportion of men, long after nature has released them from alien guidance, nonetheless gladly remain in lifelong immaturity, and why it is so easy for others to establish themselves as their guardians. It is so easy to be immature. If I have a book to serve as my understanding, a pastor to serve as my conscience, a physician to determine my diet for me, and so on, I need not exert myself at all. I need not think. If only I can pay. Others will readily undertake the irksome work for me. The guardians who have so benevolently taken over the supervision of men have carefully seen to it that the far greatest part of them, including the entire fair sex, regard taking the step to maturity as very dangerous, not to mention difficult. Having first made their domestic livestock dumb, and having carefully made sure that these docile creatures will not take a single step without the go-cart to which they are harnessed, these guardians then show them the danger that threatens them, should they attempt to walk alone. Now, this danger is not actually so great, for after falling a few times, uh, they would in the end certainly learn to walk. But an example of this kind makes men timid and usually frightens them out of all further attempts. 3. Thus, it is difficult for any individual man to work himself out of the immaturity that has all but become his nature. He has even become fond of this state, and for the time being is actually incapable of using his own understanding, for no one has ever allowed him to attempt it. Rules and formulas, those mechanical aids to the rational use, or rather misuse of his natural gifts, are the shackles of a permanent immaturity. So here is where Kant is, I forgot to mention this. Part of the work of enlightenment is to counteract dogma and to work against doctrine. Whoever threw them off would still make only an uncertain leap over the smallest stitch, since he is unaccustomed to this kind of free movement. Bro, you need to chill. She doesn't normally bite me, but she gets kind of weird about her back area. So yeah, anti-doctrine, anti-dogmatic, even the text or the language is going to be like a barrier to really experiencing it yourself directly, like with your intuition. Rules and formulas, those mechanical aids to the rational use, or rather misuse of his natural gifts, are the shackles of a permanent immaturity. Whoever threw them off would still make only an uncertain leap over the smallest ditch, since he is unaccustomed to this kind of free movement. Consequently, only a few have succeeded, by cultivating their own minds, in freeing themselves from immaturity and pursuing a secure course. 4. But that the public should enlighten itself is more likely. Indeed, if it is only allowed freedom, enlightenment is almost inevitable. For even among the entrenched guardians of the great masses, a few will always think for themselves, a few who, after having themselves thrown off the yoke of immaturity, will spread the spirit of a rational appreciation for both their own worth and for each person's calling to think for himself. But it should be particularly noted that if a public that was first placed in this yoke by the guardians is suitably aroused by some of those who are altogether incapable of enlightenment, It may force the guardians themselves to remain under the yoke. So pernicious is it to instill prejudices, for they finally take revenge upon their originators or on their descendants. So he's saying there that the people who try to inflict enlightenment on others are also inflicting it on themselves, or restrict enlightenment from others, like inflict dogma and control and obedience and weakness and inability, all these things. Trying to disenfranchise, disempower the people that they want to control. Um, and Kant's point is that in doing this, they are made weaker too. They are also not using their enlightenment. Um, and Marx basically says the same thing about capitalists, that it sucks to be a capitalist. I mean, they have lots of money and they have a lot of power and freedom, like the billionaires. Um, so I'm not gonna say like boo-hoo the capitalists, like nah, but they are, for being empathetic and graceful, they are ignorant of what they don't have, what they're missing. So the oppressors oppress themselves. Colonialists colonize their own mind, their own habits. They treat themselves not worse than they treat others, but and some fascists don't. Some fascists, there's a duality to it, right? Where they want the freedom. There's some self-colonization, but they also want to just do nothing and not have to worry or work or be effortful. So in multiple directions, enlightenment is impeded for different reasons. Thus, a public can only attain enlightenment slowly. Perhaps a revolution can overthrow autocratic despotism and profiteering or power-grabbing oppression, but it can never truly reform a manner of thinking. Instead, new prejudices, just like the old ones they replace, will serve as a leash for the great unthinking mass. 5. Nothing is required for this enlightenment, however, except freedom. And the freedom in question is the least harmful of all, namely, the freedom to use reason publicly in all matters. So this is where we talk about public versus private reason, with public being at home and writing or to the universe, to the universal audience, cosmopolitan audience. Um, whereas private reason, which he is not saying should be free, is again what happens in a local instance. In a Like he gives the example of a police officer in an organization or a priest with a congregation, and we'll read those. But on all sides, I hear, do not argue. The officer says, do not argue, drill. The taxman says, do not argue, pay. The pastor says, do not argue, believe. Only one ruler in the world says, argue as much as you want and about what you want, but obey. In this, we have examples of pervasive restrictions on freedom, but which restriction hinders enlightenment and which does not, but instead actually advances it? I reply, the public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among mankind. The private use of reason, however, may often be very narrowly restricted without otherwise hindering the progress of enlightenment. By the public use of one's reason, I understand the use that anyone as a scholar makes of reason before the entire literate world. I call the private use of reason that which a person may make in a civic post or office that has been entrusted to him. Now, in many affairs conducted in the interests of a community, a certain mechanism is required by means of which some of its members must conduct themselves in an entirely passive manner so that through an artificial unanimity, The government may guide them toward public ends, or at least prevent them from destroying such ends. So its members must conduct themselves in an entirely passive manner so they can work together to achieve some common goal. So that through an artificial unanimity, the government may guide them toward public ends. Here one certainly must not argue, instead, one must obey. However, insofar as this part of the machine also regards himself as a member of the community as a whole, or even of the world community, and as a consequence addresses the public in the role of a scholar, in the proper sense of that term, he can most certainly argue, without thereby harming the affairs for which, as a passive member, he is partly responsible. Thus, it would be disastrous if an officer on duty who is given a command by his superior were to question the appropriateness or utility of the order. He must obey, but as a scholar, he cannot be justly constrained from making comments about errors in military service, or from placing them before the public for its judgment. The citizen cannot refuse to pay the taxes imposed on him. Indeed, impertinent criticism of such levies, when they should be paid by him, can be punished as a scandal, since it can lead to widespread insubordination. But the same person does not act contrary to civic duty when, as a scholar, he publicly expresses his thoughts regarding the impropriety or even injustice of such taxes. Likewise, a pastor is bound to instruct his catechumens and congregation in accordance with the symbol of the church he serves, for he was appointed on that condition. But as a scholar, he has complete freedom, indeed, even the calling, to impart to the public all of his carefully considered and well-intentioned thoughts concerning mistaken aspects of that symbol, as well as his suggestions for the better arrangement of religious and church matters. So the symbol is like the interpretation of the canon, or the common interpretations or symbolisms of a religion or a tradition. Nothing in this can weigh on his conscience. What he teaches in consequence of his office as a servant of the church, he sets out as something with regard to which he has no discretion to teach in accord with his own lights. Rather, he offers it under the direction and in the name of another. He will say, "Our church teaches this or that, and these are the demonstrations it uses." He thereby extracts for his congregation all practical uses from precepts to which he would not himself subscribe with complete conviction, but whose presentation he can nonetheless undertake, since it is not entirely impossible that truth lies hidden in them, and in any case, nothing contrary to the very nature of religion is to be found in them. If he believed he could find anything of the latter sort in them, he could not in good conscience serve in his position. He would have to resign. Thus, an appointed teacher's use of his reason for the sake of his congregation is merely private, because, however large the congregation is, this use is always only domestic. In this regard, as a priest, he is not free and cannot be such, because he is acting under instructions from someone else. By contrast, the cleric, as a scholar who speaks through his writings to the public as such, i.e., the world, enjoys in this public use of reason an unrestricted freedom to use his own rational capacities and to speak his own mind. For that the spiritual guardians of a people should themselves be immature is an absurdity that would ensure the perpetuation of absurdities. I've certainly experienced this. Um, I refuse to teach things I don't agree with, that I don't, that I think are harmful to other people. I also refuse to have uh, things silenced that I teach that I think are helpful to people, even if, like, I won't have them replaced by other things that are also not harmful, but if they're not as important, I want to teach the things that are important. 6. But what is this? And this is so that was the entire section about the public versus private uses of reason. So that's at number 5, paragraph 5. And then paragraph 6 should be the one where he talks about the people's eternal universal right to change the laws they find themselves under. And then after that, we just have one more paragraph, and that's where he'll talk about um, rulers and what kings should do, what presidents should do. Um, what the future might look like. Okay. 6. But would a society of pastors, perhaps a church assembly or venerable presbytery, as those among the Dutch call themselves, not be justified in binding itself by oath to a certain unalterable symbol in order to secure a constant guardianship over each of its members and through them over the people, and this for all time? I say that this is wholly impossible. Such a contract, whose intention is to preclude forever all further enlightenment of the human race, is absolutely null and void, even if it should be ratified by the supreme power, by parliaments, and by the most solemn peace treaties. This is such an extreme claim. Um, it's basically if you don't have the First Amendment rights, like you can turn everything over. Like we all always have the right to free thinking and free speech. We can always question things, always criticize things, and always express those questions and criticisms and communicate with each other respectfully. And there are some things that you don't even need to be respectful about because the beliefs that the other side is espousing are violent and dangerous. And just because they're violent in a distant way doesn't mean that they're not violent, right? So there's no reason to be patient with people who support genocides and colonization. And there's no reason to be like unangry with them. You should probably be pissed. Uh, Aristotle said that. Appropriate anger. So this is one of those things that should infuriate the public, um, and make them search forth in asserting their rights and their democracy. One age cannot bind itself and thus conspire to place a succeeding one in a condition whereby it would be impossible for the later age to expand its knowledge, particularly where it is so very important to rid itself of errors, and generally to increase its enlightenment. That would be a crime against human nature, whose essential destiny lies precisely in such progress. Subsequent generations are thus completely justified in dismissing such agreements as unauthorized and criminal. So let's say the Supreme Court changes the law, changes like First Amendment rights, changes Voting Act rights, which they look like they're going to. It doesn't matter. The law is not meaningful at that point. Kant says the laws become criminal. Kant says subsequent generations are thus completely justified in dismissing such agreements as unauthorized and criminal. The criterion of everything that can be agreed upon as a law by a people lies in this question. Can a people impose such a law on itself? Now, it might be possible, in anticipation of a better state of affairs, to introduce a provisional order for a specific short time, all the while giving all citizens, especially clergy in their role as scholars, the freedom to comment publicly, i.e., in writing, on the present institution's shortcomings. The provisional order might last until insight into the nature of these matters had become so widespread and obvious that the combined, if not unanimous, voices of the populace could propose to the crown that it take under its protection those congregations that, in accord with their newly gained insight, had organized themselves under altered religious institutions, but without interfering with those wishing to allow matters to remain as before. So you create a new sect, a new religious sect. Um, the Lutherans break off from the Baptists. I don't know what history that was, and the Baptists came after. But Lutherans break off from the Catholics, right? Um, or Islam breaks off from, quote unquote, breaks off from Christianity. There was a new revelation. It's supposed to still be a Abrahamic religion. Judaism or Christianity breaks off from Judaism. Uh, there's some argument I've seen that Shinto was wrapped up in Japan, was wrapped up into uh, the forms of Buddhism that eventually made its way over there. Being absorbed into Buddhism is different from creating a sect because Kant says here, without interfering with those wishing to allow matters to remain as before. In the case of Shinto, it became a state religion that was also um, authoritarian. And as part of the end of World War II, uh, an American, I think MacArthur, General MacArthur forced Japan's government to decouple its state religion from of Shinto from the government's functioning. Right. Like that was a foreign government forcing Japan to act to separate church and state. Um, anyway, however, it is absolutely forbidden that they unite into a religious organization that nobody may, for the duration of a man's lifetime, publicly question. For so doing would deny, render fruitless, and make detrimental to succeeding generations an era in man's progress toward improvement. A man may put off enlightenment with regard to what he ought to know, though only for a short time and for his own person. But to renounce it for himself, or even more, for subsequent generations, is to violate and trample man's divine rights underfoot. And what a people may not decree for itself may still less be imposed on it by a monarch. For his law-given authority rests on his unification of the people's collective will and his own. This is what I was saying about the interesting stuff, that even though it's a monarchy, there's still some consent of the governed involved. If he only sees to it that all genuine or purported improvement is consonant with civil order, he can allow his subjects to do what they find necessary to their spiritual well-being, which is not his affair. So this is actually a very concise way of presenting John Locke's letter concerning toleration. The separation between church and state hinges on the state addressing material matters and the church addressing spiritual matters, which are two different categories in a dualistic system, or at least two different aspects of life that don't need to, that are better administrated separately, more honestly and faithfully administrated, more focusedly administrated separately. However, he must prevent anyone from forcibly interfering with another's working as best he can to determine and promote his well-being. This is what I said about not letting like some small group of citizens become like tyrants or oligarchs over the other citizens, like billionaires having lots of control over the working class. It detracts from his own majesty when he, and this is what it was like really interesting about the way that he phrases um the virtue or the arete or the excellence of leadership. It detracts from his own majesty when he interferes in these matters, since the writings in which his subjects attempt to clarify their insights lend value to his conception of governance, so he can learn from them. This holds whether he acts from his own highest insight, whereby he calls upon himself the reproach, Caesar non eat super grammaticos. Um, that might be translated down here. Caesar is not above the grammarians, as well as indeed even more when he despoils his highest authority by supporting the spiritual despotism or tyranny of some tyrants in his state over his other subjects, which is what I was mentioning. So the other part of the argument, though, is that he could learn from his subjects that want to suggest new ways of doing things. If it is now asked, do we presently live in an enlightened, this is, sorry, 7. If it is now asked, do we presently live in an enlightened age? The answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. As matters now stand, a great deal is still lacking in order for men as a whole to be, or even to put themselves into a position to be able, without external guidance, to apply understanding confidently to religious issues. But we do have clear indications that the way is now being opened for men to proceed freely in this direction, and that the obstacles to general enlightenment, to their release from their self-imposed immaturity, are gradually diminishing. In this regard, this age is the age of enlightenment, the century of Frederick. 8. A prince who does not find it beneath him to say that he takes it to be his duty to prescribe nothing, but rather to allow men complete freedom in religious matters, who thereby renounces the arrogant title of tolerance, is himself enlightened and deserves to be praised by a grateful present and by posterity as the first, at least where the government is concerned, to release the human race from immaturity and to leave everyone free to use his own reason in all matters of conscience. Under his rule, venerable pastors, in their role as scholars and without prejudice to their official duties, may freely and openly set out for the world's scrutiny their judgments and views, even where these occasionally differ from the accepted symbol. So if the leader opens up freedom for other people, they're enlightened, and their enlightenment spurs along the opportunities for other people to do it too, which then benefits them in return. Under his rule, even if it differs with the accepted, occasionally differ from the accepted symbol, still greater freedom is afforded to those who are not restricted by an official post. This spirit of freedom is expanding even where it must struggle against the external obstacles of governments that misunderstand their own function. Such governments are illuminated by the example that the existence of freedom need not give cause for the least concern regarding public order and harmony in the Commonwealth. If only they refrain from inventing artifices to keep themselves in it, men will gradually raise themselves from barbarism. 9. And there are 10 in total. I have focused on religious matters in setting out my main point concerning enlightenment, i.e., man's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. First, because our rulers have no interest in assuming the role of their subjects' guardians with respect to the arts and sciences. And secondly, because that form of immaturity is both the most pernicious and disgraceful of all. But the manner of thinking of a head of state who favors religious enlightenment goes even further, for he realizes there is no danger to his legislation in allowing his subjects to use reason publicly and to set before the world their thoughts concerning better formulations of his laws, even if this involves frank criticism of legislation currently in effect. We have before us a shining example with respect to which no monarch surpasses the one whom we honor. I think I read that like Texas citizens can't propose laws. Yeah, that's crazy to me. I mean, I grew up with like that famous How a Bill Becomes a Law, Schoolhouse Rock video. And like the kid could just propose this. Like any human, any citizen should be able to just go say, hey, we want to we want everybody to be able to vote on this idea and this way of doing things. It's strange that we don't have that. That's crazy to me. Um, that seems in contradiction with what Kant is proposing here. And I wish it was different in Texas. It's one rule I'd like to change. 10. But only a ruler who is himself enlightened and has no dread of shadows, yet who likewise, and the reason I brought that up is because in 9, Kant suggests that criticism of religious matters is specifically a leader allowing that is the opening to the leader also allowing criticism of legal matters, which would be virtuous and healthy for everyone involved. 10. But only a ruler who is himself enlightened and has no dread of shadows, yet who likewise has a well-disciplined, numerous army to guarantee public peace, can say what no republic may dare, namely, argue as much as you want and about what you want, but obey. Here as elsewhere, when things are considered in broad perspective, a strange, unexpected pattern in human affairs reveals itself, one in which almost everything is paradoxical. A greater degree of civil freedom seems advantageous to a people's spiritual freedom, yet the former established impassable boundaries for the latter. The civil freedom established impassable boundaries for the spiritual freedom. Conversely, a lesser degree of civil freedom provides enough room for all fully to expand their abilities. Thus, once nature has removed the hard shell from this kernel for which she has most fondly cared, namely the inclination to and vocation for free thinking, the kernel gradually reacts on a people's mentality, whereby they become increasingly able to act freely, and it finally even influences the principles of government, which finds that it can profit by treating men, who are now more than machines, in accord with their dignity. So when we see that everybody is an individual who is brilliant and capable of doing whatever they need to in a complex environment and a situation, then there's a lot of human capital and human value there. And we don't want to exploit that or try to, you know, milk that for all it's worth. As the billionaire does, they try to put pressure on the working class to get as much labor out of them as possible. Um, but they need rest to really bring their full value out. But again, if you just think of that in terms of like the outcome or the consequence, you're still, Socrates says in the Apology that the virtue of a city determines its wealth. And Kant is all about universal law instead of consequence. So we're going to wrap here. Um, it's interesting right here. Kant says, so Kant published this September 30th, 1784. So from when I'm recording, that's a little over 2 weeks and 245 years ago. Today I read in Busching's Wachtenlicht Nachrichten. I don't pronounce German, but that seemed pretty decent. For September 13th, and so a little over 2 weeks before Kant published this, a notice concerning this month's Berlinischen Monatschrift that mentions Mendelssohn's answer to the same question. I have not yet seen this journal, otherwise I would have withheld the foregoing reflections, which I now set out in order to see to what extent two persons' thoughts, that should be possessive persons. There should be an S after, or an apostrophe after the S. Persons' thoughts may coincidentally agree. All right. And then it was first published in December, the same journal that he's mentioning here. We could also think about enlightenment in terms of active and passive reason from Spinoza, but again, we want to read Kant on his own terms and see what he can do to enrich the continually expanding uh, perspective that we're building here. So that's going to be it for this episode. In this lecture series, in a few months, if I have time, we may do some more stuff on enlightenment. We might talk about other thinkers on enlightenment, like I think Bacon is the one that Horkheimer and Adorno jump off of. And we could read, I've presented a paper on estrangement through that before, so we could look at that paper. We could look at the actual text itself more granular. But that's kind of why I want to keep this series on enlightenment separate from the series on the grounding for the metaphysics of morals. So thank you guys for being here. Animals are resting, so no tax there. This copy, the translation I read is just publicly available online. It is, if you just search Kant's answer to the question, what is enlightenment? I don't know exactly. Yeah, it's right here. So on my site, I have it's from the New York Public Library. On my site, I have that um, citation. So there you are, guys. Let me know if you need anything. I hope that helped. If you're going to do this for the essay exam, then I think that it's like a really easy one, really short one. Um, it probably is easier as short as Descartes. So take care. Be well. Talk soon. Bye.